I love something Nisargadatta Maharaj said. He said, liberation is not an acquisition. It's a matter of courage, meaning that liberation is not something that you acquire. It is a matter of courage, and it is a matter of a really clear intention. And Natone, it was twofold, and we all know this, and we were all present in doing this, but there was something that came in about the way that she also sort of approached it. And that is that it's a twofold thing, in that what needs to be pointed out, which everybody here has received a pointing out instruction, the pointing to the self, and the pointing of the means of self-recognition. And the other aspect, which Natone was incredibly skillful at in life and in everyday happenings. And that was this potential from the point of view of consciousness itself, from the point of view of this awareness, to discern and to understand the dynamics of conditioning and samsara. Her recognition of that was from the point of view of consciousness. And one of the things all of us, I know so many of us, miss about Natone was her incredible aptitude to recognize conditioning. That was one of the things that she demonstrated so clearly in day-to-day, blah, blah, blah. Therefore, keeping this penetrating insight, which I call it on my website, conscious illumination, that there was a constancy of illumination of illusion. And that's a skill. That is a skill. And that is what the constancy of living in the Dharma, of living a life of Dharma is, right? Is that constancy of awareness. And there is nothing outside of awareness. There is nothing outside of God. There is nothing that is fragmented within our being. There is nothing that is actually divided. The only thing that potentially divides is the dynamic of the mind, which is based in deluded, which is the conditioned mind, which is essentially a mode of deluded perception. And that deluded mind moves in a mode that is sometimes not connected to self-recognition, to consciousness, to this clarity. So there's nothing outside of it. The body mind is arising in awareness. Everything is arising in awareness. The awareness is the ground of pure perception and deluded perception. The awareness is the ground of both. So perception, in terms of the, let's say, ordinary everyday mind. So let's just talk about perception. Perception is the ability to see, hear, or become aware of something through the senses. So sight, hearing, that is a level of perception. So for instance, when you're sitting in chair, which so many of us do, and you're open, there is the opening of the senses. Well, at the base of all senses is pure consciousness. Pure consciousness or pure awareness, let's say pure consciousness and awareness, same thing. That is at the base of all that is perceived. We cannot perceive anything without it. Then the other thing of perception is that is a way of regarding, excuse me, a way of regarding, understanding something, a way of understanding something, a mental or interpreting something, a mental impression. So for the most part, we perceive through a conditioned lens. We perceive as sentient, basic, ordinary human beings. We perceive through a conditioned lens. We perceive through our conditioning. And in perceiving through our conditioning, conditioned mind, that dynamic is often what creates the spiral of suffering. Because perception, in the sense of an ordinary mind, is a function of experience. So we have experiences, could be past life, this life, which is why one of the reasons we do practice, which is one of the reasons there is the constancy of accessing a pure cognitive presence. Because the conditioning, and then that creates the suffering. So what to do? In order to practice impartial, pure perception, one has to be fully present as consciousness itself. Not even as consciousness itself. There must be full presence. And there also must be simultaneously the discernment of when you suffer deluded perception. Because it's amazing. Sometimes you'll hear something and the reaction is almost immediate, right? Boom. So we're perceiving through, potentially a lot of the time, through a deluded lens, especially when it comes to something that may be of something of more significance or more importance. So along with those perceptions are beliefs, ideals, and projections about whatever is being perceived. And so those mental impressions then get thought about with more thoughts, more feelings, and tune, and there you have the movement or the cycle of samsara. And that can be an internal monologue or exactly what's going on in the world, which this is a constancy of deluded delusion. And so to take one's identity or to identify with the pure cognitive faculty that is at the base of all seeing, hearing, impression, mental impression. And that's what Newton has always constantly pointed out. She would say you must recognize, so that the attention must go there. And it's not enough. It's not enough to say, oh yes, this is all just this, and this. It cannot be a conceptual overlay. It has to be very deeply ascertained as fact, as a factual seeing, and that the delusion has no substance in and of itself. Bad feelings, sensations, thoughts, none of that can have any substance without awareness. So all of that is arising in awareness, and that's prior. That is what is prior. There's a book, Prior to Consciousness. That is what's prior to everything that is arising in consciousness. And one of the reasons for us to ever deepen the discernment of the way we perceive is twofold. In understanding our own perceptions and the dynamics by which we communicate about those perceptions, we can actually forego suffering within our own minds, as well as not create suffering for other people based on our projections and projections, our perceptions and projections. So all of the ideas, all of the concepts about, especially some of the things that are arising now, all of the concepts about, that's what's creating the battlefield. All the differing concepts is what's creating the battlefield. Because everybody is attached to perception and concepts. If you don't think you're attached to certain concepts, look really close. And I'm not saying you as individual, I'm saying in general. If you don't think you have attachment to certain beliefs, look closely. If you think you don't have expectation in relationship to others, look closely. Because this is the stuff that's binding. And this is the stuff that will keep one in samsara. And the only purpose, or not the only purpose, but the purpose of spiritual teachings, or to come together in the Dharma and to consider even spiritual concepts, and depending on the vibrancy and the frequency of who is present, we ignite and energize pure cognition, pure consciousness, because there is a dynamic energy of consciousness, right? Or, right? There's a dynamic energy that is in consciousness. And we can utilize this energy either in binding to suffering concepts, or in a greater level of perception, or a greater level of even intended thought form. For instance, the awakening of all beings, the love and compassion for all beings. Well, love, compassion, that's the energy of the true nature. That's the energy of truth. And so when we abide there, so say we do mantra, or say we put our attention there, then we are energizing that dynamic of truth. And so I think for the most part, spiritual teachings and concepts serve two functions. They are to point out the self, which is beyond concept. They are to point out that essential liberation that we already are, that nothing need be done. It is whole, perfect, essential nowness awareness. It needs nothing. it's fully realized. But it must be recognized, and it must be practiced in the recognition. And that can be subtle, but that can be great, depending. And then there is the movement of the body-mind, which is the essential mode of a self-contraction, but it is not outside of source. And if it can be seen that that is not outside of source, I think that that is then what lends courage to the mind, to the heart, to the mind. Ah,